Well, happy Tuesday, New Hope. So glad to be with you. So glad that I get to be a part of your new rhythm of life with our Tuesday teachings. Glad you're turning in and being a part of learning and continuing to grow in your spiritual walk as we are in this midst of quarantine and being divided but not alone. So thanks for tuning in and thanks for being a part of this. So if you haven't turned in yet so far, what we're doing is every Tuesday at noon, we're taking about 10 minutes to do a TED Talk about a piece of scripture or about something that is going to help your spiritual life. And since today we are in the middle of Holy Week or the Passion Week, I thought it would be great if we take a few minutes just to walk through all of the events that take place during this week. So on Sunday, this whole Holy Week or Passion Week began as we looked at Palm Sunday. And Palm Sunday is a rather unique time because what it does is it begins the Passion Week for us. It's as Jesus enters into Jerusalem for the very first time in several weeks of his teaching and ministry time. Now, Palm Sunday begins as Jesus enters into Jerusalem on a donkey. And what we see coming out of this, I want to tease a few words out of the Passion Week, is this very few first word, which is humility. Because what a donkey was a sign of for people back in that day was a sign of peace, of humbleness. What would happen typically is when a city was conquered or when a peace treaty was agreed upon, the king or the general, whoever was doing the peacemaking at that point in time, would ride into that city on a donkey, declaring that they were coming in humility and they were coming in peace. And what Jesus was declaring as he came into Jerusalem at that point in time was that he was a humble servant for his people. Now, if you remember, people were thinking that Jesus was going to be crowned the brand new king of Israel at this point in time. And this is why people began laying down palm branches, which is where we get Palm Sunday. Because people were anticipating Jesus to come into Jerusalem at this point in time as the victor. Palm branches were a sign of victory. In fact, if you joined us on our online service this Sunday, we talked about how palm branches were actually handed out to those people who were winners in the Olympic Games because it was a sign of victory for them. And so Jesus, all these people began laying down these palm branches, declaring Jesus victorious, while Jesus himself is riding in on this donkey, declaring himself coming in peace, coming in humility, coming as a humble leader and service of the people. From that point, Jesus enters Jerusalem, and what we see Jesus do next is he makes his way to the temple, which isn't unusual for Jesus because he spent a lot of time teaching and doing things in the temple. But what Jesus does next as he enters in the temple is really beyond what the norm is for Jesus. In fact, as he enters into the temple, Jesus goes in and he sees all of the money changers who were exchanging people's money whose currency wasn't correct for that time. They would exchange it at exorbitant prices. They would charge massive interest rates. And so if you gave them a 20, they may only give you $15 back or $10 back. But they were exchanging money so people could give their gifts and offerings to the temple. And on the other side were people who were selling animals that could be used for temple sacrifices as well. And as Jesus enters into the temple and he sees all of this, he becomes furious at what is happening because people are literally being ripped off in the temple. And this is where we get Jesus saying his famous line of, "My house is supposed to be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of robbers." And Jesus begins flipping over tables and chasing these vendors out. And what happens next is, in the midst of all of this, those people who have been following Jesus and know what Jesus can do begin coming up to him. In fact, Matthew records that the blind and the lame came up to be healed because they understood exactly who Jesus was and what Jesus was about. Now, after all of this commotion happens, this is when the Jewish leaders begin the plot. They put everything in action to get rid of Jesus once and for all. They figure out that they need to get him arrested, they need to get him put on trial, and they need to eventually kill him. But they need an inside man. And at this point, the 12 people who are following Jesus the closest haven't seemed to open their ranks at all. And so they begin going to a guy named Judas, who has been the money guy, who himself has been a little bit of a rebel in his past. And they make him this offer to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And at that point in time, because Judas was also thinking Jesus was going to come in victory as this new king, he does it. And he sells Jesus out. And so the plot against Jesus begins to go forward. Now, Matthew, in his account, records several teachings that take place throughout Monday, Tuesday, and even Wednesday as well. But the most important teaching, the most important thing we get from Jesus really doesn't come until Wednesday and Thursday, when they begin celebrating the Passover meal. In fact, Jesus gets his disciples and he gets them in an upper room. They get the Passover meal made for them and they begin to sit down and celebrate this meal that is a reminder of what God did for them back all the way in Israel. Now, I need to go back real quick because when we are talking about Judas, we need to tease out this third word. We've looked at humility, we've looked at victor, and we've looked at betrayal now. And so the next thing we see as Jesus begins celebrating the Passover meal with his disciples is he begins taking these emblems, this food that is all symbolic of what God did with the Israelites back through Moses and coming out of Egypt. And what he begins to do is he begins to make it about himself. In fact, he takes the unleavened bread that was supposed to be a remembrance of how quickly the Israelites had to leave Egypt, and he breaks it open and he says, now this bread is a sign of my body. And whenever you take it, I no longer want you to think of how you left Egypt, but I now want you to think about my body that I'm getting ready to break open for you. See, what Jesus does is he takes the Passover meal that was supposed to be a sign of rescue and redemption for the Israelite people. And he says, now this Passover is about your rescue and redemption from sin and death. And this bread and this wine is going to be a new symbol for you. It's going to be the new Passover meal for you that allows you to now remember my sacrifice that I'm giving to you. And after the Passover meal concludes, the Passion Week begins to speed up very, very quickly. Jesus dismisses Judas and he goes out to do what he's going to do. And Jesus and the rest of the disciples head to the Garden of Gethsemane where they begin to pray. And Jesus begins to say, God, if this can pass from me, if you can take this cup from me, please, please do. And it's at this point Judas returns and he kisses Jesus on the cheek, declares him rabbi, leader, teacher. And the guards come to arrest Jesus. Peter tries to put up a fight, but Jesus makes Peter stop doing that. He's handed over to the religious leaders of the day who put him on this fake, illegal trial all through the night. And then Friday morning, they hand him over to Pilate. Once he's handed to Pilate, this is when everything really begins to end for Jesus. This is when he is beaten. This is when he is put before the people and they say, give us Barabbas, not Jesus. This is as Pilate is washing his hands and declaring himself innocent and declaring Jesus innocent before everybody. And finally, Pilate has done all he can and he says, crucify him. And Jesus on Friday makes his way to the cross at Golgotha, where he will be nailed and hung and breathed his last. Now, as we go through the rest of the Holy Week together, what I would encourage you to do is to read the account from each and every one of the gospel writers. Because what we see is a different perspective coming out from every single writer. In fact, if you would start today and read Matthew, what you will see is Matthew connecting Jesus back to the Old Testament. There's lots of teaching, lots of prophecy, lots of understanding who Jesus is in light of what was told from the Old Testament law. But what Matthew does is really incredible as he takes Jesus and he says, even though Jesus was all of these things that the Old Testament declared him to be, he's now moving this covenant forward. He's now moving everything forward into this brand new relationship and promise with God. Now, if you then go on to Mark for the next day, you can then begin to see how quick everything actually happened, because Mark records every event and act that took place very, very quickly, because he wants us to see that what took place throughout that week wasn't long and drawn out, but in fact, it was very quickly done. Once the plan was made, once the religious leaders got involved, once the arrest was happened, it was a matter of hours that things simply happened. And then I would encourage you on Thursday to take a look at Luke's gospel, because Luke takes every effort to give you every single detail of what took place from the time Jesus entered Jerusalem to the time Jesus resurrects on that wonderful Easter Sunday. And there's so much wonderful information that you can pull out and stem from Luke's account that it's just amazing to walk through. And then on Friday, Good Friday, I would encourage you to finish with John's gospel. And the reason I would encourage you to end with John's is because he takes the focus not on the Holy Week, but on who Jesus, the person, was. And he makes sure that we understand why Jesus came to this earth and why he did the things he did. He looked at Jesus, God, but he spent more time looking at Jesus, the man, and how he entered in and went through all of this for you and me. What I find so incredible, though, about John's account is that the way he begins the Passion Week, the entire part of his gospel, is he begins it with the story of Lazarus. And what we see coming out of the story of Lazarus is really Jesus begins the Passion Week with death. If you're not familiar with his story, Lazarus is one of Jesus' friends who gets sick and he passes away. And several days later, Jesus actually goes back to Lazarus' funeral, to his tomb, and he raises him back from the dead. And what John does is he gives us this teaser at the beginning of his Passion Week account of what's going to happen. He begins it with death and new life, and he ends it with Jesus' death and new life. What's amazing, though, is that if we look back at the Passion Week in every aspect and whatever perspective we look at it is, what we see is we see death. And in the Passion Week, what we see mirrored for us is our death. Because what has happened is, for all of us who are human at this point, which is everybody, our trajectory of life is that we're going to die. There will be death. And the reason is because of sin. And the reason is because sin has betrayed us. Sin has promised us life and fun and hope. It has promised that everything in life will be wonderful and okay if we simply engage and indulge with all of that. And it has left us hopeless. But the reality is that there is a king who has come in humility to become the victor over death and to give us hope again, to give us rescue from our sins, to give us redemption from death and all of the curse of sin. That's what the Passion Week is about. And my hope and my prayer for you as you walk through this week, as your individuals, as your family, as you read through the accounts, my hope is that you will see mirrored in the Holy Week, the Passion Week, our story of rescue and redemption. That what Jesus did, he did out of love for you and I, so that we would not be betrayed by sin, but that we would have the hope that is found through the resurrected Jesus, who redeems and restores us again. I hope that you will enjoy this week, that you will go through it, that you will find the purpose and the meaning and the anchor in everything that takes place. Blessings upon you as you go through. We hope you tune in and join us on Thursday as we again enter into our time of life prayer. And if there are anything that you would like to share for us, we'd love to pray with you as well. So here's what I've got for you. If you have any comments, if you have some something that popped in your mind, you're like, oh, I need to share that. In the comment section below, we would love to hear how what sparked in your mind. We would love to hear what you're doing to help the Passion Week be meaningful for you in this time of quarantine and isolation. We would love to begin entering into a conversation about that. Blessings, peace, and we cannot wait to be with you again soon. See you, New Hope.